Building textures in Substance Designer not only allows immense flexibility when creating your textures, but also after. Not only can you make static image maps like for your normal, roughness, height, etc., but you can also build tools that you can integrate with your pipeline to give further creative control to the right people. Today we're going to create this dynamic, recycled paper canvas texture, where you can choose between two procedurally generated patterns while also giving you the option to import any image on your machine. You can further pick the base paper color and randomize the first two patterns based on a random seed. We've got a really cool material to make, so let's get started. Okay, so I've got a new Substance Graph dialog box here, and I'm going to start with our PBR metallic roughness template, and let's call this something like recycled canvas paper. I'm going to set it to absolute, and I'm going to change the width and height to 4K. They're linked here, so you just have to change one. And the reason why we're doing 4K is because we're really going to zoom in and get into those juicy, papery details. All right, so let's get started. Hit OK, and here we are with our template. So there's a couple of things I want to do to get started. The first thing I want to do is create what I do in every material, and that's a final blend. And this just lets me route our height information as we create it in the graph to the proper channels so that we can see everything in our 3D view as we go along. So to do that, I'm going to hit spacebar and add a blend. And I'm just going to right click this, add a comment, and so we can keep track of this guy, I'm going to call it final blend. So the output of this blend is going to go into a couple of these output nodes. And these are the output nodes that come with our template. So let's drag the output of our blend into this normal conversion node, which goes into our normal output. And then down here where we see our ambient occlusion output, I'm going to delete this default uniform color and hit spacebar and add an ambient occlusion node. And I'm going to pump that into our output. And then I'm going to take our final blend and connect it to this ambient occlusion node. On this ambient occlusion node, because I've dialed in some of these settings and I want to make it quick and easy for us, I'm going to go to the height depth property here. I'm going to increase this up to something like 0.35. And this is just going to help us visualize some of the things that are going on in our 3D view as we go along. And then finally, I'm going to go to our height output and delete its default uniform color. And I'm going to drag our final blend into the height. So you can see we've got our final blend going into the normal, into the ambient occlusion conversion, and into our height output. Next, what I want to do is I'm going to go up to where we have our base color and look at this uniform color here. Now, this uniform color is going to end up being what our base paper color is. So I've double clicked on this uniform color and I'm going to change it to grayscale. And so we can set it to something a bit lighter. Let's go with 0.74. So we've got kind of an off-white, canvasy paper color here. Then I'm going to go to my 3D view here, and if your Substance Designer layout looks a little bit different, all I've done is I've taken the tall sort of Explorer panel and I've dragged it into the corner here, and then I've taken my 2D and 3D views and I've just kind of dragged them and moved them around a little bit. So I've got my 2D view up top here and the 3D view down here in the corner. So in the 3D view, I'm going to go to the Environment menu and go to Edit, and I'm going to bump up the exposure here to something like 0.8. And this will make a lot more sense, but because we're dealing with some light colors and we've got certain, height information, bringing this up to 0.8 will help us visualize everything that we need to see. And so if I Control Shift and right click, I can rotate this light around. You can really see that the exposure has been brought up and it's reflecting on our material here. So I think that's all the setup that we have to do. Let's start making our texture. So what I want to do now is create our base canvas paper material. Now, if we look at this reference of some similar materials, you can see this sort of uniform grid pattern. In the process of making recycled paper, you need to squeeze water out of a pulp-like substance using a thin screen. And this leaves sort of this slight grid pattern as a result. And I hope you can see it with the YouTube compression here. So to make this grid, we're going to use a tile sampler. So let's drag this reference out of the way for now. We're going to come back to that in a little bit. And let's go into our graph, hit spacebar, and add a tile sampler. So you can see already the tile sampler creates a grid of these shapes. In this case, the pattern is set to square. So now let's just increase the amount of shapes that we have in the X and Y to something really high. So if we drag this all the way up, can see we're getting a much more dense amount of squares, creating this grid. I'm going to go even further. I'm going to set this to 80 by 80. Next up, I'm going to add a blur high quality grayscale, and I'm going to connect our tile sampler to that. Now, you can see it's blurred it way too much, but let's decrease the intensity quite a bit. I'm going to go for something like 1.54 looks good. So you can see, and we've really kind of softened out these squares. Then after the blur high quality grayscale, I'm going to add an invert grayscale. And to better see what's going on here, let's go and connect our invert grayscale into the foreground of our final blend. So now that we've done that, we can look in our 3D view, we can sort of get an idea of what kind of pattern we've begun to create. Now, you can see that the pattern that we're making right now is way too intense. The lightness and darkness values are far too contrasty for us to get the sort of subtle canvas paper that we're going for. Now, if you're making something that can easily twist off jars, or maybe some sort of lace doily kind of material, you're pretty much set. But if not, let's keep going. To flatten out this pattern, after our invert grayscale, I'm going to add a histogram range node. And this allows us to select in our histogram with some sliders what values we want to come through. So I'm going to take our range pretty far down. I'm going to say 0.01 is good. And so now if I rotate the light and zoom in, now we're starting to get the hint of that grid-like pattern that we're looking for. And we can keep the position at 0.5. That's good there. But now we can see that our grid is way too uniform, and we want to add some variation to it. So after our histogram range, let's add a warp. And for the gradient input that drives our warp, let's get our trusty Clouds 1 noise. Bring that into the gradient input. Double-click the warp. It's far too intense right now, so let's bring down the intensity quite a bit. Still pretty intense, so I'm going to dial in a pretty small number here, 0.01. And there we go. Now we can see we've got a better representation of what we're doing here. So if we look before, if I just drag the histogram range into our final blend, you can see how uniform this is. And the warp, now that I've reconnected it, really adds some of that diversity and noise that makes it look more like a realistic texture. To further add some variation, I'm just going to take these nodes and move them over. After our warp, I'm going to add some more noise on top of this. So what I can do is I can grab a black and white spots 2, that's this noise here, and I want to add some of its texture on top of our current canvas texture that we have. But if you look at the black and white spots 2, you'll notice that we've got these sort of large shapes. So we've got some dark valleys and some kind of overarching peaks. And what we really want to do is kind of filter out these peaks and valleys so that we just get the really nice texture that we have from this particular noise. So what we can do is add a high pass grayscale. And you can see now between the original noise and the high pass, we've filtered out those low end and high end values to just get that texture. Now you can further dial in this radius. So if I increase the radius, you see we get more of those valleys and peaks. And if I bring it back down, we're really getting just those high frequency details. So I'm going to keep my radius about 5.56 for now. And then now what I want to do is create a new blend. So I'm going to select the connection between this warp and our final blend. Hit spacebar, type in blend, and bring the high pass grayscale into the foreground. Then I'm going to set my blend to multiply. And you can see it's a bit crazy, but that's because our opacity is way too high. So I'm going to bring this pretty much all the way down to about, well, we've got 0.01 there. That's okay, but I think I want it to be a bit more subtle. So I'm going to dial in even a smaller number, 0.005. And now you can vary this up based on your tastes, but I think I really just want a hint of it because I know that our normal and roughness information that we're going to adjust later on is going to bring this out a bit more. But you can absolutely dial it in to your specific tastes, depending on what kind of canvas or paper you're making. So we're pretty much done with our paper here. So I'm going to make some room, and there's a couple more things I want to do before we move on. And the first thing I want to do is select the connection between this blend and our final blend and add an invert grayscale. And this is just based on personal preference. This is how I see it. But depending on what you want, you can choose which one's best for you. I think having inverted it brings out more of this grid pattern. And next what I want to do is dial in our roughness. So we've got our height for the base paper texture, but what really sells this material is the roughness and normal information. So I'm going to go and drag another connection off of this blend. This is the blend that everything's connected to before the invert grayscale and our final blend. So this blend, I'm going to drag off another connection, and I'm going to connect it to a levels node. And this levels node is going to help us dial in our roughness. So we've got our roughness here. Let's remove the uniform color from our template and just connect our levels. And I'm going to make some more room here so that we can see what we're doing. I'm going to bring our top triangle values here in. So really crushing those. You can see what's happening up here. We're really just isolating the frequencies and adding some contrast. And then I'm going to bring up our bottom left triangle here to crunch the overall lower values so that we get less of a rough texture. So I'm going to sort of rearrange our outputs a little bit so that these lines start to make more sense. So you can see what my histogram looks like and what the output looks like in our 2D view. Now we're getting sort of a paper-like roughness. And finally, to really sell these details, let's go to our normal conversion node that goes into our normal output, and I'm going to increase the intensity. And I'm not just going to increase it a little bit, I'm going to increase it a lot. I'm going to change it to 40. And now take a look at how much that's really brought out the texture that we have here. And you can see it from much further away. By really increasing our normal information, we're getting that paper canvas texture from what we've got. So I want to clean up a little bit here. I'm going to bring our normal down just to line things up. I'm going to take everything from this blend, which is before our invert grayscale and the one that also connects to our levels. I'm going to take this blend, select it, hit spacebar, and type in frame. And I'm going to call this paper. So we can keep organized here. I'm going to move this further out. And now we're ready for the next step. So now let's add some more detail to our paper by creating some creases. If I bring back my reference board here, I want to add some diversity and creases onto our paper to really sell that that's what kind of texture it is. So in our graph, let's hit spacebar and add a crystal 1 noise. You can already see how these shapes are going to lend to some creasing behavior. So I'm going to take my crystal 1 noise, double click on it, and I'm going to change the scale to a bit higher. I'm going to go to something like 52. And you can adjust the disorder to really dial in what kind of creases you're looking for. But we can do that in a bit. After the crystal 1, I'm going to add a levels. And I like using levels nodes to fine-tune how things blend in the grand scheme of things, in addition to using the opacity slider in our blend nodes. So maybe I'll just bring up the lower levels because I know the contrastiness of this noise isn't going to work too well. Then after the levels, I'm going to add a blur high quality grayscale. So I'm going to dial in this intensity to something like 0.88, something like that, just to really get sort of a fuzzy representation of what this crystal 1 noise is. And then next up, I'm going to add an invert grayscale. So now I've got something like this. So now what we're going to do is we're going to use our final blend. And right now you can see we've plugged everything that we've put into it so far into the foreground. I'm going to alter this. So I'm going to shift and click the input that's coming from our invert grayscale and our paper texture part. And I'm going to shift click that and just bring it into the background. So this is going to change everything. That's all right. We're going to fix it in a bit. Then I'm going to take my invert grayscale from our creases and drag that into the foreground. So you can sort of see the craziness that's going on right now. And then I'm going to double click our final blend and I'm going to set it to multiply. And now I'm really going to dial back our opacity. So a lot of the changes that we're making today have to do with very fine, small values because the height and detail of our texture isn't very large at all. It's all about small details today. So I'm going to dial this into something really small. Let's try 0.015. And now you can see we've got some of these creases and disturbances in our paper. And so if you want to increase or decrease the amount of creases, you can change the scale. So if you double click the crystals 1 and bring the scale down, now we've got bigger creases here. And then you can make them more pronounced by going to our final blend and bringing up that opacity. So now we've got a very, very crinkly piece of paper. So we're going to continue organizing, select all of these nodes down here, and frame them up. And I'll just call them creases. And there we go so far. Now comes the really cool part of adding color and patterns to our material. So I'm going to work up here. And up here, I usually like to keep all of my color and albedo information because it's close to our base color output, just kind of how the template organizes things. So I really want to isolate this uniform color. So I'm going to click on the uniform color that's from our template. And like I said, this is going to be the base color of our paper. So I'm going to right click that. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add a frame around it. So we're just going to keep it very prominent in our graph. And I'm going to change the title of this to paper color. So that's fine. I'm going to leave that there for now. And now I'm going to click on my graph. And the first thing I want to do is add a new node that we haven't really used before. And that is the dirt gradient node. And I really like how this noise is put together. And what it does is it adds sort of this disturbance and dirt and craziness down at the bottom, but then it fades up into this nice darker version. And we can do a lot of blending with this kind of gradient. So we've got our dirt gradient, and the first thing that I want to do is add a safe transform grayscale. And the safe transform allows you to tile and offset and rotate in a way that is absolutely going to tile. Now, this particular dirt gradient doesn't tile very well, but I'm using the safe transform because you can use this rotation knob here, and it's going to evenly rotate everything no matter what I do in these particular increments. So I'm going to take this first one, and I'm actually going to rotate it 180 degrees. So we really just flipped it over. And now what I want to do with this safe transform is add a gradient map. And so what the gradient map does is it takes these grayscale values and it remaps them to what we define in this gradient editor. So you can take a key here, change the color, and now everything that's in that darker grayscale value is going to be remapped to this red color. So you can do this manually, but if I just clear it all here, I think the easiest way to get these colors is from your reference imagery by using this pick gradient. So I'm going to bring back my reference here, and I'm using an app called Pure Ref. It's free. It's absolutely amazing. I use it all the time for my reference, and what's great about it is it just sticks on the screen, and I can continue working without it disappearing. So anyway, back to the pick gradient feature. I'm going to click it here, and then you see I've got this picker here, and I can just drag across this blue area, and I get these keys. And now you can see I've remapped that dirt gradient to these keys with all these colors. So if you remember back to our original example of what we're going to make today, we've got this sort of faux, shiny, luminescent kind of pastel group of colors. And in order to get that, the important thing we have to do here is increase the saturation of our colors because of how we're going to blend it later on. So I'm going to select these keys by clicking and dragging. And you've got these saturation value and alpha opacity, all these kind of sliders here that we can adjust all of these keys. I'm just going to bring up the saturation. And then if you want to remap these or change it, you can click on them. So I'm just going to make a new selection, and you can drag them across and change how this gradient map node interprets our colors. So I've went ahead and adjusted my gradient here, but you can see that the colors are pretty saturated. And this is how I have my blue color mapped to this dirt gradient. So I'm going to take this safe transform and this blue gradient map, just move it up a little bit. I'm going to drag another connection off our original dirt gradient and add another safe transform. And so we're going to rotate this pattern another way. And if you hold the shift key while you rotate, you can snap to these increments. So I'm going to snap to 90 degrees here. And we just rotated it sideways. So we've got our original, we've got the one that we flipped for our blue, and we've got our 90-degree one that we're working on now. So, like before, I'm going to add a gradient map, bring over our reference, go into the gradient editor, choose pick gradient, and I'm going to take this red color and just drag across. Then like before, I'm going to select all of my keys and increase that saturation. Fiddled with it a bit and got something like this. And now I'm going to do the same thing for green. Except this time, we don't need to do a safe transform because we already have a rotation that we like. So we're going to use this original dirt gradient, drag another connection off, and create another gradient map. And I'm going to go ahead and set the values for this one just like before. Great, so here's my green gradient, and we've got all of our colors set up. So now let's blend them together. So I'm going to take my red and green gradient maps, going to make a blend here. Going to connect the red to the foreground and the green to the background, and then set the blending mode to max lighten. So what this does is it kind of fills in some of those light values with the red, just enough to get a hint of it in sort of this kind of quadrant area because of how our original dirt gradient interprets black to white values. We got something like this. Next up, I'm going to make a new blend. And now I'm going to take the blue gradient map, put that in the foreground, and the green in the background, and then again set it to max lighten. So you can see why it's important to increase that saturation a bit. Because of how I chose to blend these together, we needed that saturation to really push those colors through, and the result is something really nice. You get this kind of faux shiny, almost one of those like hologram things that you find on a sticker somewhere, that kind of an effect here. So let's blend this onto our base color here. So I'm going to make a new blend, and I'm going to take our colorful blend here and put that into the foreground of the new one. Then I'm going to take our paper color, or uniform color here, and put that into the background. Now, this isn't going to blend very well right now because we have to create some masks and fill in the opacity slot. But if you just want to see what's going on, let's just fill in the color of our paper for now. So I'm going to take this new blend here and pipe it into the base color output. And now it's not working yet, and that's because originally we had our uniform color set to grayscale. And because you have a grayscale input and a color input mixing together, it doesn't really know what to do with it. So we're going to double click our uniform color and switch it back to color. So it's still the same initial grayscale value, but now it's feeding in color data into this blend. So it's happy. So now we can see our color on top of our paper here. So let's keep organized and select all of our nodes here. I'm going to select all the dirt gradients, transforms, and this colorful blend, and leave out the paper color in this blend for now. And I'm just going to hit spacebar and frame it up and call this color gradients. So I'll give you just an overview of what we've got so far. We've got our paper, we've got our creases, and we have our color gradients. Now, I don't know if you've ever made paper in arts and crafts as a kid, and I know that this is certainly making me want to do this again because it's a pretty fun experience. But one of the things that really defines what recycled paper looks like are the extra bits of paper or magazines or newspaper that you use to create this pulp. So if I go back to my reference here and I'll just pull it on to the screen, you can see we've got all these different colors and specks and patterns here that we have that kind of go along with this recycled look. So I thought it'd be great if we created a couple variations of patterns that we can then switch through. So let's make some of those now. So I'm gonna make some room, and I'm just gonna bring the paper down, and let's sort of work in this top left quadrant here. Let's start with our first pattern. I'm gonna click on our graph and hit spacebar. I'm gonna pull up grunge map 004. That's what this guy looks like. And our grunge map has a couple properties. We can adjust the balance here and the contrast as well. But I'm going to modify this grunge map with a histogram scan node. And I use this all the time to create masks. It's so useful. So I can drag up the position, and you can see that that sort of exposes and filters through the histogram of our grunge map. So I can just drag this up and allow more information to pass through, and then increase the contrast to really focus in that mask. So I'm going to leave the contrast at 0.5 and slide up the position to allow just a bit more. Maybe something like 0.37 is good. So we've just dialed in a little bit of these extra sort of swirls that we've done. But I want to shake this up a bit more, and I'm going to add in another noise here. So let's add a dirt 1. And I'm going to do the same thing. So connected to that dirt 1, I'm going to hit spacebar and add another histogram scan. Slide up the position of this one. You can see we can allow some of these specks in, and we can choose how many specks we want to include. And really, if I zoom in here, I don't want that much. I think I'm going to add maybe something like that. That's good. 0.07 is good. And now let's blend them together. So spacebar, blend. I'm going to set this blending mode to add. And we can put the dirt on the top, so that histogram scan, and then the grunge map histogram scan in the background. And you can dial in the opacity if you'd like to, but I think full opacity is good. So now we just have a couple more specks in here. And that's pattern number 1. Let's look at pattern number 2. I'm going to hit spacebar and grab a cells 4 noise. This is a great noise. And you guessed it, I'm going to grab a histogram scan. So I'm going to take that contrast, and this time I'm just going to drag it all the way up to 1. And then if we increase the position, we can choose how much of these cells we want to add into our mask. Now, you can also go in and double click on the cells and change the scale. So if I double click the histogram scan to see it in the 2D viewport, but then single click the cells 4, if I increase or decrease the scale, you can see what we're doing here. I think what I want to do is set my cells to something like right around here. 38 is good. And then for our histogram scan position, don't want too many. So 0.03 is good. Now these cells look cool, but they're sort of very sharp. They really don't look like pieces of paper that were ground to a pulp and then pressed together. So to break this up, after our histogram scan, I'm going to add a slope blur grayscale. And to drive the slope of this slope blur grayscale, I'm going to use our handy clouds 1 noise. So let's pipe that into here, into the slope input, double click on it. We're not going to see too much. So let's adjust this a little bit. Let's bring our samples all the way up to 32 and bring the intensity way down. So let's zoom in on some of these pieces. Now you can see we're getting a distorted look here. So let me just bring back the intensity just so we can maintain the shape of what we were originally going with. So maybe let's put in 0.2. So that's good. Now let's zoom out a bit. And that is our pattern number 2. So let's take a look at what these patterns are doing to our paper. So remember, we're creating masks here that we can then filter our color gradients through. So a really easy way to do that, let me just bring up our color gradients and leave some room. Let's take our blend from our first pattern, left click and drag that output and middle click to pan over. I can zoom in with the middle mouse wheel and bring us into the opacity of our blend. Now this blend is the one that connects our paper color to our gradients. But now take a look at our 3D view and we're seeing that pattern shine through and we're getting this really cool kind of painted, splotchy, canvasy look. So we can switch this out. Let's go to our second pattern and pump that into the opacity slot of that blend. We're getting a completely different pattern here. Now this is great. You can adjust all these patterns to your heart's content, but wouldn't it be cool if we could drive this with an image? So I'm going to make some room for a third pattern option here. And I'm going to drag in something, I don't know, how about the Substance Designer logo? So I've just dragged that into our Substance Designer grid, and I chose to link it up as a resource, and so now we have this as a bitmap. You can also find your resources under the package that you're currently working on with the graph, and it created this resources folder. You can twiddle that down. There's our logo. So there's a couple things that we need to do to this bitmap in order to turn it into a mask and allow most images to work with our setup here. So after the bitmap, I'm going to use a grayscale conversion node. So that's pretty good. But then after that, I'm going to get a quantize grayscale. So the quantize grayscale node, if I take a shape, let's grab you don't have to follow along here for this, but if I go and choose paraboloid and I pump this into the quantize grayscale node, look what it does. It takes those smooth gradient grayscale values and quantizes them into as many levels as we decide. So if I bring this up, you can see we can add as many levels as we want back to original, or bring it down and choose how many steps we have. So really actually what I want is just to quantize this down to 2. But you can adjust this depending on how many levels of grayscale values you want for your mask from your image. For now, I'm just going to keep it at 2, but you can adjust it later. So I'm going to delete that shape, reconnect our grayscale conversion node to the quantize, and this is what we have. For this particular bitmap and the way it's gone through, you can see that we have a black logo on a white background, but as masks go, we really want white because white is what shines through and black is what doesn't. So I'm going to go and add an invert grayscale so that we have something like this. And now if I take the output of our invert grayscale and bring it into our opacity like before, you can now see we have our Substance Designer logo with our gradients shining through. So this is good and all, but you can see in order to switch through these, we have to go through the process of connecting these nodes every single time. Substance Designer has a really cool node that makes it really easy to switch through patterns like this. So you can pull that up by hitting spacebar and getting our multi-switch grayscale. So let's take a look at this node. If you double click on it, you see we have two inputs here and we've got some parameters. So the first thing we want to change is the input number. This is how many inputs we're going to switch through. So if I bring the input number to 3, we now have 3 inputs. And you can increase this to as many as you'd like. 3 is all we have for now. And so what I want to do now is take our pattern 1 and put that into input 1, second pattern into input 2, and our image into 3. So now if I change this input selection parameter, we can now easily swap through each one. So now what I need to do is just take our multi-switch grayscale and put that into our blend's opacity. So now if I change the input selection, we can switch through our patterns. So let's keep things organized here. I'm going to select everything, frame it up, and call this patterns. So we've got a working graph, but now we really want to enhance this and turn this into a usable tool that you can easily generate maps from using something like Substance Player or integrating it with your 3D program like Cinema 4D, Maya, or Max. And to do that, we need to create some inputs and functions. So first off, we know that we want to be able to input an image as a pattern. So how do we do that? Well, if I hit spacebar and type in input, we've got some options here: input color, input grayscale, and input value. So for the most general case, let's choose input color because that would be a color image that you bring in, and we've already taken the steps necessary to convert it into a black and white mask. So input color it is, and I'm just going to move and replace this bitmap with this image input. You can choose to keep this around or not, up to you. I'm going to delete it for now, and I'm going to go in and remove it from my resources. So if I double click on that input that we just created, there's a couple parameters that we need to adjust. First off, I'm going to change the identifier. This identifier is going to be called image underscore input. And the label is sort of the user-friendly version. So I'm going to call this image with a capital and a space input, like that. So you can see the difference here. The identifier has to be one string of characters. So usually the convention is lowercase with an underscore connecting things. And then the label can be more user-friendly. Next, we also want to be able to change the base color of our paper. So instead of this white, you can change it to any color you'd like. So I'm going to scroll over and go over to our paper color, uniform color here. And I'm going to double click on that. And now what we need to do is right below where it says grayscale and in this output color pane, you see this little function graph looking icon. Click on that and choose expose. And so you get this dialog box. And what you want to do for the input name, you want to change what it has here. It says output color, but if you have multiple uniform colors and you're changing the output color property, these are going to get very confused. So I'm going to choose new, and I'm going to call this paper underscore color. A very similar convention to what we did with the image input. So I'm going to say OK. So now you can see his input name, paper color, and choose OK. And now you can't adjust this paper color just by double clicking on the node. You can see the properties have disappeared here. To change that property, you have to double click on the graph. And where you have these input parameters under parameters here, you see we have paper color. And if we twiddle that down, now you can change it. So if you want, you can drag the value all the way down and you can have a darker color, or you can go crazy and make it green. And there's one more input that we want to change, and that is our pattern selection. So let's go to our multi-switch grayscale, and just like we did with the uniform color, I'm going to go to the input selection parameter, find that graph icon, click on that, and choose expose. And so I'm going to change this input name to something like pattern underscore selection. Hit OK. So that's selected there, pattern selection, okay. Now I'm just going to double click on my graph, scroll down to where it says input selection, and you see it still says input selection because we didn't change the label. In fact, we also didn't change the label of our paper color. So while we're still on input selection, let's just change this to pattern selection. So that's the user-friendly version. And then I'm going to go to paper color, go to that label, and add paper space color. And if we want to preview what this looks like, go to the preview tab. And so we've got our paper color dialog here and our pattern selection. But notice if we drag the pattern selection too far, we're running out of patterns to choose from. So we can clamp this off. So let's go to parameters again. And we're going to go to our pattern selection parameter. And let's change the maximum with this max slider to 3. So now if we go to our preview and scroll through our pattern selection, you see we can't scroll anymore. And we can just choose our 3 patterns. So let me scroll out here. You can see what our final graph looks like. We've got our components where we've got our paper, our creases, patterns, and our color gradients, and they all lead into our final outputs. And so I like to select my final outputs and frame those up. Just move those over a little bit. Outputs, and I usually make those something like red or some darker color. And so if you want to sort of experiment with how this tool that you've created works, select your package and then go to this S with a play. This opens up Substance Player. And so Substance Player lets you experiment and generate maps with the substance file that you just created. So you can see here we've got our paper color option. I can click on that. I can change the paper color. Let's say I want it to be something dark here. And then we can go through our pattern selection. So there's pattern 1, pattern 2, and we got to our image. Now you can see it says drop a bitmap here. So what we can do is either drop it in or we can click on this, choose our image, and there you go. You've got our image coming in. And so if we go back into our pattern selection, and I'm going to reset our colors here, you can randomize these patterns with this random seed option. So just hit randomize, and you can choose a different seed to generate your different patterns from. Same thing goes for the second pattern. And there you have it. So we just covered a bunch of useful features in Substance Designer. We built our texture tool one component at a time, which makes texture making feel a bit more like building blocks, in that if you focus on one aspect of your project at a time, you can then have a better understanding of how you would then organize your project and create your next textured masterpiece. The power in Substance Designer isn't just in its multiple nodes, but in its ability to let you create powerful tools to enhance your pipeline. I hope this project has helped spark your imagination in what some of the possibilities are. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below. And if you enjoyed this video or found it useful, please give it a like. It lets me know what you'd like to learn and what kind of content I should create next. Speaking of which, if you'd like to see more content from me and this channel, hit the subscribe button and hit the bell to be notified when I post new videos. Until next time, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Building textures in Substance Designer